It is a fact that your day is going to be just a little bit more joyous if you're wearing a shirt that's covered in hearts. Hi, my name is Jane. I sew clothes using secondhand materials. I'm kind of on a mission to create the weirdest, funkiest clothing possible that's high quality but also inexpensive to create. I'm quite new to YouTube, but I'm very excited to be sharing my sewing journey, I guess you could say. Tutorials, vlogs, just general arty, crafty stuff. With all that being said, today we're going to be making a heart blouse, which is what I'm wearing. This was one of the first things that I made last year, and so the construction of what I'm wearing right now is not very good. I actually used heavy duty spray on starch, which has since become one of my favorite possessions. I do like it, but I rarely use it because it's so much easier to use a tiny zigzag stitch to applique stuff on. I folded all the edges of all these hearts under and then used a straight stitch to sew them on, and if you sew, you know that that takes so long. So today we're not going to be doing that. However, this project is quite time extensive, so I would just keep that in mind. I'm not going to lie and say it's a quick project. It's not. I think that the result is worth it. With all that being said, this is good for beginners, except there are some exceptions here. First of all, you're going to need to know how to sew. I mean, just use a sewing machine, kind of finish garments. I would say this is good for people that have sewn a few garments but want to kind of level up and create something that's a little bit more funky than what they have done. What's cool about this project is the fabrication and not necessarily the piece itself. This is a very simple blouse. I have a zipper in the back, but you can do buttons. The one that I'm going to be making today has buttons on it. Actually, this is not going to be a one-day project. This is going to be a week-long project. I'm using a vintage pattern that I found. We'll go over all of that later. With all that being said, for this project, you'll need a sewing machine and potentially a serger. That's totally optional. It's just up to you if you want to finish your edges with a serger or with a sewing machine. You're also going to need fabric. Now, this project is really great because it can use lots of little scraps that are at least the size of your hand. So I guess medium-sized scraps, but it's great because you can use lots of different colors, lots of different textures of fabric. You're also going to need the basic sewing supplies like thread, pins, needles, buttons, or a zipper. Maybe some interfacing if you want to interface your collar. And now for this project, I really do recommend having a rotary cutter and a cutting board. Some people say this isn't necessary for sewing. It's absolutely not necessary. However, because this project is constructed of lots of squares, it's very easy to cut them out with a cutting board. With all that being said, let's get started making this project. All right, let us begin. The very first step for this project is deciding what size of square you're going to be creating. I recommend anything between the 4 and 6 inch range. I'm going to be doing 4.5 by 4.5 inches for my squares. Anything smaller than that is really going to be a lot of work for you because you have more squares to cut out, more hearts to cut out, more hearts to sew onto squares. In general, just way more steps. And anything bigger than that just wouldn't create the same effect, in my opinion. And before cutting out your hearts, I do recommend kind of having a pattern in mind. What are you going to be doing? How much fabric are you going to need? I can't tell you how many hearts to cut out or how many squares to cut out because that's totally up to you. Next, you're going to be creating a heart for your squares. Now, I use paper to do this. You could also use buckram or something a little bit stiffer, not just a cotton. And once you trace out your heart, make sure that it's a little bit smaller than your square, i.e. like whatever your seam allowance is, make it a little bit smaller than that. So my heart is at least 1/2 inch smaller than my square on all edges, just because I don't want the heart to be caught in the seams whenever I'm sewing the hearts together. Once you have your square size and your heart decided, you're going to cut out a bunch of them. However, I said earlier that you need to have your pattern kind of picked out because you can either create enough squares to individually create patchwork pieces for each of your pattern pieces, i.e. for the sleeve, you're going to create a big enough square to cut out the sleeve from that, or your pattern will always say, you know, you need 2.5 yards of 54 inch wide fabric. So you could just create 2.5 yards of 54 inch wide fabric, whatever you want to do. So I've made probably about 50 hearts now, and I cannot remember how many hearts this top takes. I want to say it's around 100, especially if I'm doing long sleeves. Gosh, onwards and upwards, I guess. I said that this project was great for beginners, and I stand by that. It is really great for beginners, and it's also super cool and funky and fun, but it does require a lot of patience, as usual with my projects, because I mean, if you want your project to really stand out and be fun, I think the more time the better. So this is my heart pile at the moment. Pretty good, honestly. I have some favorites for sure. I really like all of the bright colored ones. Pretty fun. My color scheme here, I wanted to mix up all of my super bright colors with like browns and like muddy plaids, just because I think it creates a really fun contrast and I don't really use that color scheme. So see, that's like a kind of ugly shirt fabric behind a really fun red. I also have like, I actually really love this plaid. somebody gave this to me. I did not buy it, but somebody gave me a whole bunch of this plaid fabric, and then I have just like a really fun 80s blue cotton on top of it. Ooh, wow. So I'm at home for the holidays using my grandmother's sewing machine from the 80s. It is a new home, which I think became Janome, and it's working really well. And it's funny because it actually like runs the exact same as my Singer Heavy Duty that I bought last year. But I do not have any of my sewing patterns with me, and I don't have any like drafting paper or the will to draft a pattern right now. So I think I'm gonna go to a local antique mall and see if I can find a pattern that I can use for this shirt. Because I might be selling this shirt at some point, I'm gonna tweak some things because obviously you're not supposed to sell patterns that are not made for commercial use. So I'll make it my own. I just don't really want to deal with making a bodice block right now, which I know that's so easy, but I'm just being lazy. It's also going to be challenging to see if this machine will do a buttonhole. I'm really nervous about that. But I'll be back in a little bit. Oh, and I'm getting my hair permed today. So if my hair looks fabulous after this, it's because I got it permed. If it looks stupid, I'm really gonna regret this. I'm really gonna regret this. Success. I found this one, and I think that that shirt is going to be very cute. But I'm going to change a couple things about it just because I didn't want to copy a pattern. I forgot to mention a crucial piece of information, and that is how do you attach your hearts to your squares? Well, turn your stitch length down, turn your width down, and just do a very, very tiny zigzag stitch twice around the entire circumference of the heart. So you want to make sure that you're keeping your needle on the heart whenever you pick up your foot, I think it's called, to turn around so that it's a pretty smooth line. It overall looks really nice, and I've also noticed that it doesn't really matter what color thread you use because it just won't really, I don't think it'll matter if you're using different colors of hearts and squares. It's all going to be funky. Once you've put together enough squares, you can start putting them in rows to then put them on your pattern piece and see how many rows you're going to need and what kind of length you're going to need for rows. And then before I sew the rows together, I like to iron them so that my seams are either all going in the same direction or going in opposite directions, just so that the piece is going to lay as flat as possible. Again, this is really up to you. You can just do whatever method you like best and just see what works for you. I started with the sleeves because if you're doing a puff sleeve, the sleeve is actually massive. It's so big. It's honestly bigger than the bodice pieces. So I just like to get those over with first. I also kind of like when I'm patchworking to make sure that if I'm gonna have a yellow, it doesn't go right next to another yellow. That's just a personal preference, but whenever you're putting your pieces together, just kind of try to be conscious of what you've done before and what's gonna go on top of that row. All right, I got my perm. It's drying. It's gonna be so sick. I actually really like it. I just want to keep it as curly as possible, so I'm trying not to mess with it for a little bit. However, that's not what I came on here to talk about. What I came here to say is that I am making one of the sleeves, and my biggest concern for this project so far has been, what do I do with the inside of it? Which is probably a concern that lots of people have for lots of projects because it's always challenging. Especially because I'm probably going to end up selling this. I want the inside to be just as pretty as the outside. However, the inside looks like this, which it's not terrible, but I don't have access to a serger, and I think that's a good thing because not everybody here is going to have access to a serger, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out all of my pattern pieces with a super lightweight cotton, and I'm actually just going to top stitch this onto that cotton. So it's not really a lining because it's going to be attached to this. However, the inside of that is just going to look a lot nicer than this. There will be no raw edges. I'm going to finish everything up really nicely. I might even wait to construct the piece until I'm back at my regular room where I have my serger. The other alternative to that would just be to do a French seam or to do a zigzag stitch. And it's not the end of the world if there is a raw edge showing. I just really don't want that for this project. And by the way, I have to hold my like hair thing up. That's why I'm doing that. My sleeve took 32 squares. 32, that's a lot, which means the other sleeve is going to take 32, but that also means that the back and front are going to take that many as well. I'm going to have to make more squares, but it's okay. It's worth it. It's totally worth it. I can already tell that I love the color scheme I've got going on. Also, my sleeves are like so voluminous. They're going to be so fabulous. And I'm also thinking that this top, I'm doing a short sleeve, but a very, very puffy short sleeve with a bow tie. And I think this top is going to be so adorable underneath a pair of overalls or like an overall dress, some kind of dress that goes on top of it or something like that. It's just going to be super cute. But we're going to continue sewing squares together and then sewing squares onto pieces of other stuff. But anyways, are you so excited to see my perm? Look at the bangs. Wow. As I poorly explained earlier, I basically cut out my pattern pieces with my squares, and then I cut out my pattern pieces with a very thin cotton lining and basted the squares on top of the cotton lining, just sewing lines alongside each of my seam lines because that's very easy to follow and I knew that they would be straight. And this created a very uniform, clean effect. Listen, I rarely go for cleanliness in my projects, but it is something that I'm trying to prioritize because it overall adds a lot to your finished piece. I have finished all of my pattern pieces, which is so exciting, except for the collar. But I'm deciding, I think I want the collar to be a contrasting color. And I was playing around with it last night and I was looking at like red or this really bright blue. And then I think I decided that just like a simple off-white would look best. There's also really cute bows on the sleeves, so I think I'll do off-white for those as well. I very sincerely apologize for the change in scenery that's about to take place, but I'm gonna finish this project at my apartment where I have my regular sewing machine that's not from the 80s and my serger. Just because I want to sell this piece eventually, I don't want to have raw edges on the inside. I really want to serge those edges, and I think that the buttonhole on this thing is just not going to work out for me, so I'm just going to hold off on finishing it. I've got the bulk of the project done. I'm glad I cut everything out. That took by far more time than the rest of this is going to take, but again, sorry for the change in everything. I'm about to move up to a different room. I've just been at home for the past week or so working on this. I am back in my bedroom slash sewing space that I usually use. So let me show you around. If it seems disorganized, that's because it absolutely is. However, I kind of know where everything is. I've got lots of different crafts going on, you know what I mean? So I know that anybody who works also out of their bedroom knows that it's a bit tough at times, and the floor is your best friend. First of all, I have the ironing board. I do most of my ironing on the ironing board, as well as some cutting, a little bit of pinning. You know, it's just my general like work board if I'm not going to sit on the floor. But most of the time I'll sit on the floor. One of these days, maybe 10 years from now, my back is just really going to start to have a lot of issues. That's okay. My ironing board is my general workspace because my table or my desk is not really functioning as a desk. I have my sewing machine and my serger on there, and I'm not gonna lie, I've not taken them off since I put them on there in August. So that's where they sit. I also have some beads, pins, pencils. I have an impressive like jar collection of stuff on my windowsill, and whenever we have like tornado warnings, because I do live in Arkansas, I have to like take everything down and then I put it back. But anyway, I also have a very nice thread holder. Whenever I like move into an actual studio, I'm definitely gonna get a pegboard. I've seen so many of those and I really like them. But for now, I keep all my thread over here, and then serging stuff, is it serger thread? Serger thread doesn't fit on there, so I just keep it behind there. But I also have a little bit of a collection of like sewing books, pattern guides. I kind of reference those whenever I need inspiration for a new project. I have several shelves throughout the room where I keep miscellaneous craft supplies, embroidery stuff. Like, I don't know, whenever I'm making garland, I just like sometimes make star garland, and so I'll keep the stars in this little box. Yarn, zippers. I mean, sewing is just kind of messy. There's a lot of stuff you need to do it. Also, look at these curtains. I love them. I made them in August and they add so much color and light to the room. Oh, they're covering up a horrible stack of French books that I have to read this semester, but it's okay. I'm sure they'll be interesting. I think that's everything. In general, I don't have a dress form. This is all you really need to sew, I feel like. I keep my fabric beneath my bed, as many people do. It's convenient, however, I'm running out of space. So I've started to keep some in my bathroom, which is a little bit ridiculous, but I need to sew so that I don't have so much fabric anymore. As all of my pattern pieces were at this point totally finished, I began to add darts, which feels so tedious and annoying, even though it's really not. It's so easy. You just take a little bit of chalk or a fabric marker. I've ultimately decided that chalk is superior in every way to fabric markers, but you're welcome to change my mind in the comments. Anyway, you just take a piece of chalk and mark your darts, and then you sew them, and it takes maybe 5 minutes, but I always procrastinate this step in any project. Once I had my darts put into both the front and back bodice pieces, I serged the edges so that they were looking nice and clean. This was the whole reason I waited to finish this project until this room, which I know the lighting is very poor. There's like a 2-hour window of lighting in this room. That's good. But anyway, besides the point. If you're wondering what this crazy wall is behind me, I spent a couple of years totally obsessed with art, painting, and drawing, and so I always curate a very specific vibe for the place that I'm living in. This is really silly, but I'm sewing with my earmuffs on because the sound of the sewing machine lately is just getting on my nerves. It's so loud. I've thought this many times before, but someone needs to invent a silencer for sewing machines. Like, why does that not exist? My roommates would probably love that because the sewing machine is so loud. But this helps muffle it a little bit at least. And I've tried putting it on like a towel before. Nothing really works. It's really loud. The way I go about constructing this blouse is just to put the front and back bodice pieces together without trying to match up the squares and make sure they're even, just because you do have a bust dart that's in the side of the front piece, which really cuts through your square, and it would just be very hard. However, I think that you would be more than welcome to try that if you were interested. It's just not really my vibe. So I did put the front and back bodice pieces together before even tackling the sleeves. I was debating if I wanted to put a collar on this because the pattern that I bought comes with a collar, and it is cute. It's a little Peter Pan collar that goes around the neck. It's also a really high neck, so I might tweak that a little bit. I was debating what color I should do, and I was thinking, you know, bright red, bright blue could be really cute, but I think that it would just be too much, and, you know, it just, I don't know. I think that this light blue will be a lot better. I kind of like that it's super boxy because the nature of the heart pattern is also really boxy. It's a bunch of squares. So overall, I think that the shape of the blouse goes really well with the fabric that it's made out of, which is always a good feeling. Very cohesive, I guess you could say. After putting together my front and back blouse pieces, I cut out my collar, 2 for each side of the collar, out of this. I say it's 80s because the vibe of it just feels 80s. I don't know what it is, but it is a cotton. And I also cut out my collar out of interfacing and put all of that together. The typical way you do a collar with interfacing is edge finish it, so sew a line around the edge. You know what, just look it up. I'm sure there's vintage tutorials on that because I can't really explain it. But then once I had my collar attached, I decided to do a bias tape finishing. I promise that I do know all of this stuff because I sew all of the time, but words just evade me whenever I'm trying to describe it to people. Anyways, I did do a bias tape finishing for the neckline and folded the back pieces over to put the buttonholes in as well as the buttons, which I did. I just didn't show that. And then I began to try to gather my sleeves. However, I quickly learned that this was not going to work out, so I had to gather them by hand, which is fine. It just takes a little bit longer. And I sewed I don't know what to call it, the bow pieces for the sleeves, which go on the bottom of the sleeve that has been gathered. There is some gathering at the top of the sleeve as well, but just a lot less. I found it a lot easier to control my gathers when I was doing it by hand, and after gathering the bottoms of each sleeve, I attached the bow piece, which is pretty similar to a piece of bias tape. However, I then top stitched it, and I did not like the way it looked. I think that it looked kind of messy, and it just wasn't what I was going for. So it became time for seam ripping, my very, very favorite. I took that off and redid it with a slip stitch, and I think that that looks a lot better. It is the next day. Last night, I finished sewing the collar onto the blouse. I finished gathering the bottoms of the sleeves and then putting the cuff on, the little bow tie cuff. I think it's adorable. And I put the buttons on the blouse. Now, I was pretty nervous about this because buttonholes can be a little bit tricky. However, I think that they're the most straight buttonholes I've actually ever done in my life. I also chose my buttons, which is always my favorite. I collect buttons whenever I see them for cheap. At thrift stores, I'll usually buy them, like little jars of them for like $5. I found these 6 matching white kind of pearl buttons. I don't know if it's not made of pearl, obviously, but the effect is shimmery. So let me show you the shirt. All that I have left to do is attach the sleeves. The collar is quite cute, and the back of it is looking quite nice as well. I'm not going to show it on me because it's chilly, and also I'm just going to wait until I finish it in a couple minutes. The sleeves are right here. These might be some of the most puffiest sleeves I've ever done, and I actually took some of the puff out of the pattern, so they're not quite as big as the pattern I initially said. But I love the bow at the bottom of it. I think it's so adorable. I do need to gather the top of the sleeves, and as I complained about already, I can't gather this with my machine. It's just not working, so I'm going to do that by hand. It's just, you know, the top portion. Attach that on, and then it shall be done. This is going to be so cute under overalls. Just wait. Just give me like a second. The very last step in this project is attaching the sleeves. At this point, you've honestly put in so much time putting together your hearts, putting together your patchworking, putting together your pieces. So this step is really just the icing on the cake. I believe it is finished. So let's go run around outside to show off my new heart top.